Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Melbourne Athletic Development Podcast. Jack,
John.
we've been working through some scenarios recently where people have been asking us a lot of questions about programming for speed training, and particularly like in the preparation of sprinters and how that differs from athlete to athlete and what influence that potentially has on injury, but also on their performance.
I think particularly too, because it seems to be different philosophies out there about how you go developing a sprint performance specifically. And obviously certain camps have certain beliefs around one particular method being better than the other, but perhaps that being a bit more nuanced in terms of when it's more important to focus, say, on pure speed development versus working on building up.
I think the relevant thing is, and this is a very nuanced discussion in the sense of we're talking about developing sprinting performance. So we're talking about, athletes who run predominantly on the track and the different approaches you might have, even say for people who do the same event in say 100 meters. And we're really lucky, obviously, to have Freak on recently. And it was a really good discussion because it starts to form some of the foundations for what I think is relevant this. And I know that some of the conversations we've been having off air are around should some athletes who are trying to develop speed be doing more volume? Should some be doing less? How much density should they be doing in their program? Like how often should they be trying to do maximal speed sessions? And I think all of that all feeds into some of the different aspects of what's driving adaptation.
Yeah, and I was going to say, and then also putting into context the individual characteristics of the athlete. Because I think one of the things we need to consider is their individual profile, and we'll talk a bit more about that. But then I think the other big ones are perhaps their training history is a really big one, so i.e. maturation. Well, they're probably the two really big ones in particular. So where do you think we start with this conversation?
Well, I think the way we start is we say, okay, what are the main things you need to consider when you're trying to decide what type of speed program you're going to give to your sprinter? And I think the first thing that needs to be done is work out what their profile is, right? And when we say like what kind of profile, they're obviously all fast athletes, and in the conversation that we had with Freak, it was like, if you were to do a muscle biopsy on these athletes, it would all say that they're predominantly fast twitch.
Yes. And is that a good enough categorization in itself, or do we need to start thinking about further subclassifications within that type of fast twitch profile?
Right. And I think there's different categorizations get used in sort of colloquial terminology by coaches. Like one that I've heard more recently, and there's a Swiss coach who's having a lot of success as one of the national coaches for the Netherlands at the moment. He talks about the difference between flyers, like diesels and flyers. Right, and they're both sprint athletes, but the diesel is the athlete who needs more training volume, can handle more density, and likes to do a lot of speed work consistently. Whereas the flyers, they're really good at doing lots of speed work. They don't tolerate as much volume, and they probably want less density in their program. Right, and those diesels too, they tend to respond a little bit more to a bit more volume, and even sometimes running that's a bit slower actually does help them develop some of the characteristics that will be important and valuable for them to run faster overall.
Why do you think that is? Because it seems to me, just keeping it simple, that the best way to get faster is work on your top speed, but that doesn't actually seem to be always be the case.
So I think this is where the conversation needs to go, because the first thing that we need to say is if you want to get faster, the thing that's probably most relevant, and it's a general training principle, is the principle of specificity. So I think it's very clear and it's very obvious to people that to get faster, you need to run fast, right? The adaptations that you get are going to happen both at a neurological level. So, your brain learns to coordinate very high velocity movements and the skill sets that are needed for that. And the second aspect is that you develop the peripheral tissue changes over time. Now, some people are naturally born with some of those tissue changes that they need, and we just spoke about it, like muscle typology, where fast type, type 2A, type 2X, they've got a smaller distribution of type 1 muscle distribution. So there is this concept and this idea that we need to keep in mind, that we're trying to see which changes we need to have. And I think the reason that we see the differences is with very specific training, in the categorization of the fact that it is sprinting, it's maximal. We need to think about that from the characteristics of what does that do in terms of the mechanical load that it imposes on the person. It's very high mechanical loads. And for that reason, the risk of injury is high. And we know that it's high in sprint events, particularly things like muscle strains, because you're going close to your maximum capability. And it's the analogy that always gets used, obviously, is things like, a Formula One car, right? They go very fast, but they're very temperamental and they break easily. And whilst you can build up more robustness in these athletes, the difficult part is when something is working at its maximum, there is probably less margin for error because there's not a lot of redundancy in the system. And for those people who are engineers or have looked at some of this stuff, they would know and they'd be aware of the fact that, like if you look at stress life curves, for instance, which look at a material's ability to deal with cycles of stress. Now, usually it's a piece of metal or wood or whatever it is. But if you look at, say, someone's capability in their tendon or their ligament or even their muscle tissue, the more high magnitude that stress, i.e. with what we're talking about, maximal and very high magnitude mechanical stress coming from maximal velocity sprinting, the number of cycles needed for failure in a material is typically much lower than if you're doing a much lower magnitude. And this is the principle that I think gets people into trouble when it comes to sprinting, because we know that specificity is going to have the biggest stressor. It's also going to place the most mechanical load, and it's going to create a lot of, fatigue and all of these kind of things. So,
well, I was actually, just to add on that, I think that's actually an important principle with any athlete, because the reality is specificity will have the biggest influence on performance. But then other types of training, whether it's like specific training related to the sport or other training modalities, help to support the system to be able to withstand the mechanical, psychological, technical elements related to that particular sport. And I guess with running, this is probably where a combination of both perhaps is needed at times too, where you can't clearly run at 100% all the time, but at the same time too, if you're doing too much at sub-maximal for certain types of athletes, could you see potentially a negative effect, do you think?
Definitely. And I think that's where the profile comes in, right? So we obviously spoke about muscle typology. I think that is something that lays the foundation for what is going to be useful for those athletes. Like we spoke with Freak about this concept of how do you train? Do you do things that people are good at, or do you work on, and their strengths, or do you work on their weaknesses? And what seems to be really clear from their research, and obviously that's only one part of it, it's the muscle physiology and the muscle typology and architecture.
Yeah, so it's just not the only system involved, but an important one.
But it appears from what they're starting to do, and if you start to extrapolate on that it's very obvious if you are trying to change or work on someone's weakness, then you're potentially putting them at a big disadvantage for what they're designed to do.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense too, because if you think about it, if you've got, say, an ultra-fast twitch type profile, but you're getting them to do more sub-maximal volume, that to them is actually relatively a larger stressor. And maybe not necessarily in the magnitude of mechanical forces, as you mentioned before, because obviously running at the fastest speed is by far the largest mechanical force, but there are going to be certain metabolic stresses that will then influence, say, their active stiffness properties, and therefore their susceptibility to injury. So that's an important thing to remember, that we all have certain physical strengths. I mean, some much better than others, but when it comes to sprinters, thinking about those certain sub-profiles or certain profiles within sprinters, working to those strengths does make sense, because it allows them to be able to I guess also control how much stresses they're actually exposing themselves to, because they're going to always be they're going to develop themselves based on what strengths they already have.
So I think the important discussion then to have is, okay, how do you profile?
Yes, well, I mean, again, this is another conversation that we had with Fred, but thinking about, well, I know certainly for you there are certain kind of clinical or performance markers that you could look at, and then maybe you can also in the future look at other types of technology to do that. But
yeah, well, obviously we discussed, for those people interested, listen to the podcast that we did with him, looking at how you can potentially work out some of those underlying profile features. But I think from a functional standpoint, it's actually quite obvious what kind of profile people fit in. So say if you're coaching sprinters and say you're coaching a 100-meter athlete, people, as we mentioned in that podcast, people self-select a little bit.
yes,
So if your athlete is someone who barely makes it to 100 meters, they're more of that 60 meter, 100 meter profile, like their strongest part is their acceleration up to 60, 70 meters, but then they fade, then they're likely to be much more on that fast twitch end. And for that reason, they're probably going to benefit from very high intensity training, but maybe not be able to tolerate as much volume of training, particularly around the density, because the issue that you've got is they can turn the volume up really, really high. But as we said, with that stress life curve, it can cause a lot of mechanical tension and damage. Whereas if you profile on the same premise, like if you've got a 100-meter sprinter who actually does pretty well when they go to 200 and even can maybe run a 400, then that they're still going to be predominantly a fast twitch athlete, but they've probably got more hybrids that are in that type 2A and maybe a little bit more intermediate in their profile, which suggests that they are going to have some of the metabolic machinery needed, because those muscles will develop that similar metabolic machinery for more intermediate, as well as some of the neurological changes that are a little bit different. Now, those neurological changes are going to be ones where they don't fatigue as quickly, but the actual maximal output they can create is less.
Yes.
So this is why...
There's always that trade-off.
And it's not that the performance that these athletes can attain is any better or worse. Like you might have two sprinters, and we can use the examples over time. But like if you look at, say, for instance, say like someone like Shelly-Ann Fraser-Price, probably I would consider the best female sprint athlete in history. There's obviously arguments about others that could fit into that category. But if you look at her, she's very much a front-ended track sprinter. Very fast over the first 60. She's gotten a lot better over time at holding on, but typically she's really, really good in the first half of the race. And if she gets out to a reasonable lead, she holds what she's got. But she's not necessarily running away from people, right? She's gotten to the point where in her career now where she does pretty well holding on to it, whereas in the past they would come back to her really quickly. If you contrast that with athletes, I'm just trying to think of a female sprinter that is maybe the opposite to that. One is eluding me at the moment. It'll come to me. But essentially the athlete who tends to be further back and doesn't start as well, but then comes flying home, they're the athlete that you start to consider, okay, maybe they don't have that really, really high, type 2X, really, really highly driven neurological changes. But they are in the position where they are going to be able to still get to the same point by holding their speed for longer, for instance. And so it means that the performance may not actually be that different, but how they approach it and what kind of training is going to be useful for them is part of the equation. And as an example for that, I have some awareness of what, say, Shelly-Ann Fraser-Price does, but for instance, my estimations would be that person's going to do a lot better doing mostly short acceleration and maximal velocity work with, reasonable recovery and not doing too many bouts of that across a week, versus someone who really comes home strong. They're going to be the person who really likes doing those intermediate distances, the 60, 80, 120, 150 meter distances. And actually they run better by doing that because it's in their wheelhouse, and their wheelhouse is they're good at top speed, but they're also really good at just maintaining top speed.
I was just going to ask, thinking about these certain profiles, do you think that someone like Shelly-Ann, like she works obviously on her acceleration because that is her strength. it's not to say that she doesn't work on holding her max velocity, but in terms
I'm sure she does a lot. Yeah.
but as a fraction of what she works on, it's still important to continue to work on maximizing that strength, because that's something that naturally is going to continue to augment, you think, more so than the second half of her race, for instance.
Definitely. And I think it's like, as I said, it's that question of, are you there to try and enhance people's strengths or close the gap with their weaknesses? And the answer is probably a little bit of both.
Sure.
As you mentioned, like I'm sure she does a fair bit of, I don't know her program intricately, but I'm sure she does a fair bit of training that is, more related to, holding her speed at the back end. But at the same time, like, we know that not only is it going to match their physiology, there's a psychological component to that. It's like people like to do training that they're good at. They like to do competitions that suit their skill sets, rather than doing things that doesn't necessarily suit them. So I think when you start putting that into context with some of the discussions that we've had recently, I think it starts to give you a picture of what kind of approach may be more beneficial, as well as what's maybe going to leave that person less likely to get injured, right? And I think there's a big...
And it's actually just worth highlighting, those two things do overlap.
Oh, massively.
And I think that's something that probably we'll talk a bit more about later, actually. Yeah.
But I think we can probably start to shift into some of that understanding now, because I think the thing that this shifts the discussion towards is away from potentially coaches having a standard philosophy that is based purely on a methodology of training that they have used, more to a principles-based approach. And that principle is, creating and profiling your athletes into subcategories so that you can maximize and optimize the adaptations that they get. And on a really basic surface level, if you want to do it at that really basic categorization, are they a diesel or are they a flyer? And if at a minimum, I think you kind of almost need to accept that those people who are fast probably fit into those two categories. And in your methodology, you've got to start to think like, okay, maybe I need to approach one or the other. I think one of the reasons that we've had issues with this in the past is there's been some very, very prominent coaches do really well using one methodology, say, for instance, more volume. And for people who are in the track world, they probably know the idea of like a long to short program where you start with longer distances and higher volumes at lower intensity and work towards faster and shorter distances, versus the coaches who like to go what we call short to long, which is they start with much shorter, much more highly intense distances. And as the athlete is tolerating that, they try to extend how much of that speed that they can hold or carry.
When you talk about particularly like the long to short, it sort of fits in with that traditional kind of resistance training methodology, right?
And that traditional methodology that we've spoken about, that Matveyev, Russian or Soviet training model of high volume, low intensity, and that gradually gets lower volume but higher intensity over the training cycles.
Because the other thing I think too that is a sort of preconceived belief is that is actually more protective to injury. But I guess the reality, like as we're talking about so far, it's actually not necessarily the case, because again, if it probably does for most people, because most people probably fit into that intermediate profile. Like I'm just talking about an individual in general, not necessarily the high end of just the fast twitch profile, thinking whether they're ultra fast or moderately fast, where most people do respond will be okay with doing that particular model. But there actually are going to be certain people, particularly elite sprinters, who that's actually going to have a negative effect, suggesting that type of stressor causes a decrement in performance and potentially an injury as well, or a higher susceptibility to injury.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that that's something that needs to be considered, because I think that previously the thought would have been, oh, we're protecting them. But actually you're probably making them more fragile if you're giving them training that is against the profile that they fit.
Yes.
Like I've had athletes who fit into both profiles, and I've made the massive mistake of picking the wrong methodology and having disastrous, not only performance results, but also disastrous injury results, where as a less experienced coach, as I said, you stick to your philosophy rather than working from first principles. And I think that that's what you have to kind of shift towards. And those principles can be broad, as I said, like maybe you have 2 categories. I think there's probably more if you want to get really nuanced. And I think we spoke with Freak both in the discussion, but also maybe outside of it as well, of like how nuanced can you get even within someone who is considered a fast twitch profile. What's the difference? How many, we spoke about Z scores away from the standard in terms of whether they're slow twitch or fast twitch. It's like, are they very, very, very slow twitch, or are they moderately slow twitch, or are they an intermediate, or are they, they're more fast twitch, but they're not, ridiculously fast twitch. And I think you've got to work towards some of those. And I think over time you kind of work out what those athletes are through trial and error. But it's important that you start that process early. And as I mentioned, I don't think it's that hard to work out. You can even ask the athlete, like, what event do you prefer? Is the shorter the better? Do you like doing lots and lots of hard training? Do you enjoy the lactic type sessions? If they say,
can you run every day, or do you need a couple of days recovery in between high intensity sessions?
Right.
Yeah.
And it's not to say that these envelopes don't change and you're not trying to change some of those with training. So for instance, like one of the difficult processes that I've gone through over time is seeing athletes who come in who have probably actually been trained incorrectly for their profile. And then they're so fragile that if you expose them to the things that they're even good at, they're still very high risk of injury. So you've got to go through this process of exposing them gradually to it, knowing that there's actually a fair bit of risk in that. I've got an athlete, and you work with him quite a bit from a physio point of view, who's like, he's had a reasonable injury history. And I had to say to him, like, just be aware, we're going to put you into this more systematic approach. And I think it's the approach that will work for you, but it's going to be bumpy. And you're going to probably have some, niggles and injury issues as we go, because you actually are so far down the wrong end that your tissue is not even ready to accept this kind of training, even though it appears on the overall, that's probably the type of training that should work for you.
Do you think this principle of profiling an athlete and thinking about how you develop their attributes based on their profile applies even to team sports? Because
100%.
Because, I like think about soccer, AFL, whatever it is. There are obviously different running demands because, it goes for a certain period of time. There's obviously repeated bouts of efforts you have to do. So there's obviously a little bit of variation in how you train them, but still you do think that ultimately you need to think about the profile of the individual. Are they more of that fast twitch, intermediate, slow twitch, and structure their training accordingly? Because... Or I guess with even in a track or in a team sport, there's probably going to have to be differences more in how you develop their conditioning, I guess, specifically then too. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's hard in sports where, for instance, someone's skill level dictates that they should be performing in their sport, but their physiology doesn't match that sport.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Right. And so, like, for instance, I think AFL is a good example of that. It obviously slants towards a well-conditioned athlete.
Yes. And
it's actually probably one of the things that we see. It's probably one of the criticisms that you have, for instance, of a lot of the Indigenous players is their conditioning isn't very high in terms of aerobic conditioning.
All right.
But their skill level is so phenomenal, and their explosiveness and their jump capability and their skills are so good, and they're so good at reading the game and all of that kind of stuff, that it's worth having them in the team, even though you know that you may not be able to play them in a position that dictates they need a lot of conditioning.
Because the reality is the way that the sport is played is dictated by the majority who tend to fit in that more high aerobic conditioning.
And like, that's not to say that there aren't some that do have very good aerobic conditioning.
Sure.
And it's a generalization. But it's not a surprise to me that we see a lot of very explosive, very fast, very skillful, small forward / midfielder, Indigenous players, right? Because their profile dictates that they have that explosivity to them, and their skill level is so high that they're very good, in terms of goal kicking and being able to kick goals from, all sorts of obscure angles. And you've even had players, for instance, that, were smaller players, but they're so explosive that they're taking, these huge speckies and all this kind of thing and jumping on people's shoulders, that it doesn't really match necessarily what you would expect, but they can do it because that's what their physiology dictates. And maybe, and I'm sure there's been a lot of that in the past, of like forcing those players to do grinding 1K reps, 3K time trials, it's always been the case that you hear, oh yeah, they don't really engage too much with that. And I don't think it's because they don't want to be good at it. I think it's because their physiology is not designed for it. They're designed to go fast and be skillful and kick goals, but they're not really there to be like, oh, I'm going to run 25 Ks today during this footy match. So, and again, that's a generalization. There are people that would fit that category, but I think it's important to understand that, because if you build that understanding the profile, then you can start to pigeonhole people and build the characteristics that you want that will strengthen their strong attributes. And potentially, as we mentioned with Freak, and you brought up before, of like potentially we actually change their injury risk profile, because we spoke with him about the concept that they found in football players or soccer players, that the injury risk profile for people who were considered more fast twitch was 5% higher for hamstring strain injuries across the season.
5 times.
5 times.
5.3 times higher.
Cool. All right.
Yeah,
so 5% probably wasn't the high.
Yeah, no, massive difference.
So with that in mind, as I said to him in the podcast, is that because you are training them incorrectly, or because their
actually more
physiology makes them more susceptible? And he said, well, we don't know that because we're not really at the point where people are profiling in these individual sports to that level to see whether there is a general change in that profile injury risk. So I think this is what we see of like in athletes that fit into either category. If you train them incorrectly, and as I said, this doesn't matter if you're someone who's more of that diesel, like if you have someone who needs more training and they need more density, they don't necessarily run fast. And the thing is, when you expose them to training that's, say, highly intense with very long recoveries, they actually are more likely to get injured because they're not used to, that's not how they achieve what they achieve.
Thinking about then going to that philosophy of, doing more volume before intensity for sprinters who have that appropriate profile, do you think a lot of the benefit then for them is they actually just feel good in response to that training then too, if they're doing like a little bit more sub-maximal to...
You're saying for all sprinters, or you're saying for the ones who need more volume?
No, for the ones who actually respond to more volume, who do respond better to that longer building to shorter. I think part of that is because they actually do feel good in response to doing slightly sub-maximal.
Oh, yeah, 100%.
As opposed to the other one who's like, well, if you're just spending a lot of time at 90% but doing more volume, they actually just feel bad because and their profile isn't developed for such.
Yeah, 100%. I think you're spot on there. I think there's an issue with that of working out, and this is something you mentioned earlier, like what their training history is and, how mature they are to the amount of volume they can do in the first place.
Yes.
Because volume's obviously different to the type of training they're doing, the actual stimulus or the exercise selection and the prescription of that. But the thing that is really clear is we see this over and over and over, that there are people who in certain programs do really well because it fits their profile, and that happens a lot where you'll get someone who needs, that little bit less intense training, but they really excel in that environment.
Yeah, and look, it's a challenge when you have, say, the real ultra fast twitch profile where it's like we're just going to work on intensity first and then make sure you get adequate recovery to be able to train at that intensity when as often as you need to. Goes against that idea of like, well, no, you just need to do more because more is better by default. Even if you feel tired and you're struggling to recover, and it's affecting your subsequent performances. It's like, no, you just need to keep pushing through and you'll eventually get there.
Yeah. Well, the problem is, as I said, there are people who are like that, who the ongoing training stimulus, they will respond positively to if you allow enough time. Whereas there are the others that are opposite. And as I said, this comes down to that, both neurological and tissue physiology. That the muscle fiber typology they have is one in which, like, the more work, it's actually going to stimulate more development of those areas. So it's not that it's unreasonable to expect that. I think the part that gets tricky is when you're working out, one, you got to work out their profile, but two, you got to work out, okay, what's their current level of ability to tolerate training stress? Because if you have an athlete comes in, they've never really run before, you might work out really quickly, okay, they're more of a fast twitch athlete, or they're more of a diesel and they need a little bit more volume. They tend to kind of wind up with the way they run. But picking the amount of volume that you need for that person is often a very difficult task. And that's where I think often that training prescription goes wrong, because we pitch too much or too little of that, and that underprepares them for that performance.
Yeah, well, and that's the question I wanted to ask. For someone with a low training history that clearly has high speed capacity, how do you go about developing that? Because I know you often hear that analogy of someone who's a really good sprinter who's 15. They've got the software, but they don't have the hardware. But then the question I have is, how do you develop that hardware? Do you still think you need to think about those different profiles in the fast twitch athlete and think about developing their hardware according to that particular profile?
Definitely. And obviously this is something we talk about a lot, tissue properties and tissue capacities, and understanding that, like, if someone basically has no muscle bulk at all, you probably need to develop some muscle tissue in a 15-year-old athlete in order for them to tolerate the stresses.
And that's going to be more through concurrent training with resistance training.
Like adding in some resistance training to develop some injury, reduction capabilities. So you do need to consider that. But the big thing that's going to be protective for them is the training they're doing appropriate? Is the volume of it appropriate? And have they been exposed to the stresses that they're going to be exposed to in competition? And that's something that I think really changed my viewpoint on how much training is required. Because I think, unfortunately, we often work historically. And what I mean by that is, like, we've always done this session. And if you do this session, then you're prepared for this competition. And it's like, well, again, that's not very nuanced to the individual profile. I think the big thing that you have to do is you have to kind of stress test that through competition, and you need to work out very clearly what is the stress that they're going to be exposed to in the competition in terms of not only the intensities, and sometimes that's hard to replicate outside of competition, but particularly the volume and the density of that competition. And what I mean by that is, how many race rounds do they need? So if they're at the national championships and they've got 3 rounds of the 100 and 3 rounds of the 200 or whatever it is, and it's going to be over 3 or 4 days, do they have the capability of doing that? And have you exposed them to that at a certain level throughout their preparation? Because if you haven't done that, then maybe they are underprepared and they're not doing enough training to prepare for it. But saying, for instance, that in training you need to do 8 repetitions at maximal, say 8 by 100 at maximal intensity when you're only ever going to do 2, doesn't make sense if you say, well, we do that because we've always done that. Like, that's a session that my coach gave me and I gave all my athletes, and it means that they're prepared to run two 100s. And it's like, well, that might be overkill, right? For some people it might be underkill, who knows? But it might be overkill. So don't stick to it if you don't know that that's actually making the changes that you want for that individual, right? Because if you want them to be able to carry that out in competition, then you've got to work back from that. Now, I understand, because sometimes you can't replicate the intensity, that you may want to do a little bit more volume, but doing 3-4 times the amount of volume is probably not helping you either, right? Because it's not really preparing you for the same thing. There's no point saying to someone, okay, you were getting ready for the national 100 meters that has a heat, a semi, and a final, and saying you've got to be able to do 8 maximal intensity runs. Like, what are you're preparing them for the wrong event,
Mm.
especially if you're truncating, say, the recovery. If the recovery is 10 minutes between those maximal 100-meter reps, well, that's not replicating the competition.
Is that something you often think back to with programming, is how far am I deviating away from exactly what's required?
100%. And that's, I think, something that you need to consider in terms of very heavily when it comes to that immature athlete.
Mm.
When I say immature, I mean, physically immature and immature to training stress and competition stress. But with them, you have to think about that consistently. Like, if they're doing lots of 80% intensity training because that's what maybe one suits their profile, and two, that's what their body will allow at this point, because you're not ready for them to be running maximally 2 or 3 times a week, for instance, then you need to consider heavily, are they even prepared for competition? Because that's one of the things that I think we see often with athletes. And I always see
This is like this for general athletes, not just with specific profiles.
I think this is something that we see consistently, and it happens in very similar time courses. So like this tends to happen always around October, November, right? Because people have come off the preseason. This is in Australia. People come off the preseason. They've been doing lots of volume at a lower intensity, and then all of a sudden they go, "Oh, we're racing in the next month. Let's up the intensity." But because we're not racing yet, we don't need to drop the volume. And then all of a sudden they strain something, and then they're chasing it all season. Oh, I'm injured. I did my hammy, or I strained this, or my Achilles is hurting. And it's like, okay, this is not going to work very well. But it happens really, really often because people don't start to put that picture together and say, if we're raising the intensity, we probably need to drop the volume, and we need that to be gradual. It can't be just going from, last block was the volume block and now this is the intensity block. You do that, then that's probably too big of a change too quickly in terms of the stimulus. And I think that is done over a much longer period with developing athletes, where you have to say, okay, if I'm going to put them in competition, I need to make sure that they've at least ticked these boxes. At a minimum, if you say, okay, I think they're going to get 2 rounds, or maybe they're only going to get 1 round because you go, okay, I'm going to send them to a local inter-club competition. I know they're going to get 1 round. Have they sufficiently done training? You might say, I need them to have run at least 95+%. And I probably want them to have done 2 or 3 repetitions to make me pretty confident that 100% effort is going to be sufficient and safe for them to conduct, right? But that doesn't mean I need to see them do it 10 times, because that potentially is not preparing them for what they need. And I think you should, I've mentioned this, I think, before, but there's a great coach from the Netherlands called Henk Kruijnhof. And Henk is a legend. I've spoken to him a number of times, but he always refers to training as poison, particularly sprint training, because of the intensity of it. We spoke about specificity at the start, where he says, like, it's all, the poison is all in the dosage. And I think to extend upon that, I think the way that you have to look at it is very much that Goldilocks effect of, like, it can't be too little and it can't be too much. It very much has to be just right. And if we start seeing it as, the right amount is the elixir, but too little is ineffective, and too much is, it's like medication. It's like medication.
It's like optimizing the hormetic effect, really, because that a stressor needs to be enough where there is going to be some negative effect initially, but ultimately your job is to provide enough stimulus for adaptation, but not too much that it takes them a week to recover.
Yeah.
Because that clearly doesn't lead to good outcomes.
The big thing you'll see is if you start to apply the training that does suit their profile and you're gradually increasing their ability to tolerate those stresses, as long as you get to the point where they're covering off on what they're going to do in the competition, then I think you will very quickly work out, okay, that's enough. And you can, as I said, you can stress test this, because you don't typically, the good thing with athletics at least is we typically get lots of opportunities to compete. So, which is a nice thing, because you can test a lot of things. So you can say, all right, this week they have 2 rounds of a race. Might be 2 different events, a 100, 200, or it's a 100, 400, or it's a 2 rounds of 100 meters, a heat and a final, or something like that. And what's really good about it is you can go, all right, what happened with their performance in those? Did they get better across the rounds? Did they get worse? Did they feel really fatigued? Did they feel like their performance, has it improved, decreased, whatever it was? And that's really effective for you working out, have you pitched the training at the right volume, the right intensities? Because if they go into the competition and they improve through the rounds, then they're obviously quite prepared, and they're prepared well for the competition. Especially if they're close to their best performances and all that kind of thing, given the conditions and X, Y, Z. But if they are then put in a position where they run, the first round is really good and the second round is really poor, and that happens, repeatedly, clearly they're not doing enough of the training at the right intensity and the right volume in order to prepare that individual for that event. And your job is to work out, can I get closer to that and or achieve that by the time we get to the major competitions? Because the last thing you want to be doing is get to a major competition and actually feel unprepared for it.
With that in mind, like you mentioned before about the off season, where that typical approach is to do more volume and work to more intensity reflective of what they need to do for competition. For that flyer type profile, what does that actually look like? Are you still thinking about more volume relative to them, or do you think it's a different
because
approach?
and typically because it's usually the weather is different, right? And so we don't necessarily have warm weather, so you're not necessarily going as fast, but the intent is reasonably close to that.
Sure.
I think
so. It's actually works out maybe well in a way of having 4 seasons like we do in Melbourne, where it is cold.
Yeah. Like you get the opportunity, for instance, where the training's, the intensity is probably not going to be much beyond 95%, and most of the time it's probably a touch under that. But that means you can do slightly more volume without necessarily thinking there's injury risk.
Sure.
And then there's, we've spoken about this before, but there's ideas around like polarized training, and people like Charlie Francis speak about the idea of like it should be 90% up or 70% down in terms of the intensity of the running that you're doing. He was not a big fan, for instance, of doing anything in that intermediate speed because it's not necessarily improving your speed, and it's not necessarily, it's too fast to work on some of the conditioning aspects because you can't do enough repetitions. And so I think the thing that people like Charlie started to popularize was this idea that you have complexity in your training where you're doing all of these elements at the same time in that, vertically integrated kind of model. You're not just doing only speed work.
It makes me think of the opposite of marathon runners, where most of their running is sub-maximal, like sub-competitive speed, and then they do a little bit of above that.
Yeah, and I think I know we're getting him on the podcast at some point soon, Greg Hath, and he talked about like the pendulum model of periodization, where most of the training elements are there, but what you're doing is gradually changing the pendulum from being more focused on, say, like slightly higher volume and the intensity is a little bit down, and then shifting it towards, maybe more speed work with lesser volume. And, you're at that point where you're doing more volume, maybe you're working more on strength elements, and then you shift towards more power and explosivity and those kind of things. But those elements are all there. It's not you're doing none of them. It's just, and it's, as you said, with the distance runners, it's like they're always going to do their aerobic conditioning. They'll be doing some form of speed work. How much will kind of vary depending on the time of the year and the event that they're doing and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, the thing I'm taking from this though too is we need to be a bit more nuanced when we talk about like volume and intensity, because it's not to say that your flyer type profile doesn't have higher volumes at times, but it's more of a relative to what their strength is, i.e. working probably more at intensity, but at periods you might be working slightly below that to allow quote unquote a bit more volume to build, as opposed to
this is not to say that you shouldn't work on their weaknesses.
Yeah.
But it's probably going to be further away from the major competitions. And like a pure example of this would be, say, if you had a diesel type. What I mean by that is, it's not that they don't like doing speed work. They do. It's just that they probably are happy to do a bit more of it, and they're probably happy to do it closer to their main competition. And do it, say, for instance, in the race week. They might go and do something pretty fast on a Monday and a Wednesday, and then have a couple of easier days. And then they'll do a warm-up on the Friday because they kind of need to get their system going, and then they'll race on Saturday. Whereas you have someone who's a real flyer, and maybe they'll only do something quick early in the week, or maybe midweek they'll do something really like a couple of blocks and things like that. But then they'll do lower intensity stuff for the rest of the week. And it doesn't mean there's not technical work,
Yeah, like they're probably good examples like cats. They sleep, for 3 days and all of a sudden they get up and just bolt to go and catch a bird.
And it's funny. That's the analogy that gets used by a coach who's been really popular in the US high school system, a guy named Tony Holler, and he talks about feed the cats. And what he's saying sprinters and true sprinters, and he's saying true sprinters, he probably means very fast twitch sprinters.
Yeah.
He said they're like cats. They like sleeping and they like going fast, and that's about it. And if you treat them as such, they will reward you with better performances and less injuries. Whereas, and he says this in a non-derogatory way, but even in temperament, distance runners are more like dogs, where they like work, they like play, they like being out and doing things, and they don't want to sit still. They want to do things. Not all dogs, but, it's that very active sort of like, farm dog. It just doesn't want to stop. It wants to run around all day. And he's saying, distance runners are like that. And if you get them mixed up, you're not providing them with the right training environment or right training stimulus to get the performance out of them.
Yeah, look, it makes you think of the more pure the profile, the more specificity is valuable, as opposed to...
Yeah, if it's more hybrid...
you probably can get away with that. Well, not get away. It's probably more important to have some generalizability to some of the training, because it does seem to form an important foundation to their resilience or anti-fragility.
Yeah, overall, I think we've covered off on most things, but overall, I think the important part when you're designing how you're going to build speed for a sprint athlete is understanding what the profile of that athlete is, and establishing, what kind of training does seem to work for them, working out what their level of training capability is based on their training history, and determining whether that's appropriate to keep applying or you need to build more on or do less of. And the main way to do that is working out, based on their competition needs, whether that volume of training they're doing is sufficiently allowing them to execute their best performances in competition. Because I think that's one of the things that there's always these dumb discussions in the sprint world of they only run fast once a week. And it's well, does that work for them? Because if it does, and they can run rounds and they're not dying by the third round, they're actually running personal best in the third round, then that works for them and their profile and their training history. But if they're not, then it seems appropriate that maybe they need to build the volume that they're doing in that session, or they need to build the volume, across the week of speed work that they do so that they can run out the race, or the type of speed work that they do. So I think they're not relevant. What people do to achieve the performance in itself is not that relevant other than to that individual. So this, and it happens a lot, is people just copy other people, and there's a lot of historical kind of things we've always done this session, or I think this is the session, and coaches will go copy other coaches' sessions. But it's build what you think that athlete needs around them. And early on, if they're a junior athlete, obviously you're not going to get too specific with it, but you just kind of work out, I think they sit more in this profile, so I'm going to give them a little bit more of this. If they're a little bit more of that diesel, a little bit more generalized, I'll give them a little bit slightly longer, a little bit more volume of it, and we'll build their capabilities of getting to really high intensity over time. Or if they're really, really fast, which, they're good in Little Ass, they do 70-meter races, so they're really good at 70s, they're okay at 100s, and then 200 they can basically not even finish it, then they're probably in that other profile. So, maybe keep things short and sharp with them and gradually see if you can add more sessions of that or more volume of those, rather than giving them lots of, they're not running out the 100, let's give them lots of 150s. It's and Henk Kranoff speaks about that with the athlete he had called Nelly Koeman, who at one point held the world record in the 60 meters. She was super fast twitch. And the coaches, when he was a young coach, and the coaches said, give her more 150, she's not running around. She goes, she ran slower overall, even though the last 40 they measured it was faster. So it's no, we've got to stick to what works for her, and that's doing fast stuff. But that's not going to work for that athlete who is, the 100, 200 type, who really does, they do lots of 150s, they're flying. That's the program that works for them.
I mentioned too, a lot of people probably get away with sticking with maybe one philosophy of longer to short? Because probably most people do fit into that profile.
Yeah, we probably have less people that are that super fast twitch.
Yeah, at least in our society.
Yeah, especially probably in Australia as well. So you get away with it. But I think the better way of approaching it is go from first principles, work out their profile, develop an understanding of what their current training stress capability is, and determine based off what they need for competition if they're meeting that. And if they are, then you don't need to increase anything. And you might even realize, like, what can I take out, and see what they can use from that.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, mate. If you've got any questions or you would like to reach out to us, do so through social media or our website.